My name. It is pronounced Data.
Oh?
You called me Data.
We all wonder about a single question that poets, politicians, and scientists have been debating for centuries. And that question is what it truly means to be a human. In the late 1980s, a profound exploration of this exact same question came out from the positronic brain of a synthetic who had pale skin and golden eyes. And his name was Data, Lieutenant Commander Data, the beating heart of Star Trek: The Next Generation. In the history of science fiction, I think Data's journey is one of the most cinematically explored journeys. So, to understand this character, I gotta tell you how, for the first time, it came to the mind of the legendary Gene Roddenberry, who was developing The Next Generation.
No.
He didn't want to copy the original Star Trek directly, but he wanted to capture its essence. He was deeply moved by the character Spock, who offered an outsider's perspective on human behavior, but instead of reimagining Spock, he introduced a character who was not human after all. Spock was strictly adhering to logic and the suppression of emotion, but instead, Roddenberry wanted to create an artificial human character whose emotions are suppressed, yet who desperately wants to be a real human. Data was basically a sci-fi Pinocchio when Roddenberry first conceived the idea. He wanted to hold up a mirror in front of humanity to see their own flaws and quirks through this character's innocent and unclouded eyes. However, to execute such an ambitious idea, they needed perfect casting, which happened rigorously. They had many names and faces in their minds until Brent Spiner became the perfect cast for Data. He was charming and had that innocent look on his face, but after reading the script, he actually got the assignment. He gave Data a very Chaplin-esque attitude and gestures, which amused people and sometimes made them sympathize with his robotic dilemma. Spiner gave this character boundless curiosity, but with a gentle earnestness. And his brilliant range even led the writers to create more characters that Spiner would also play, such as his evil counterpart Lore and his creator Noonien Soong. During the very first table read, Spiner thought the name was pronounced Data, but Patrick Stewart said it must be Data because of his polished British diction. However, Roddenberry announced a new rule that whichever pronunciation is mentioned on set for the first time will be the official pronunciation of Data. The value that Data brought to Star Trek: The Next Generation was huge. Data is like a child in the body of a super advanced machine, but it doesn't understand jokes or human emotions in its initial stage. So, the questions he asks are worth thinking about. They're not consciously philosophical, but they are deep. And through him, we get to experience big ideas in a very natural way. As I'm going to talk about him more vividly in the video, in The Measure of a Man, his right to exist was put on trial. It asks everyone that profound question, whether he was everyone's property or he was alive. And then, in The Offspring, we saw him create his daughter, Lal, whom he eventually lost in the most tragic way possible. Then, in episodes like Brothers, Descent, and Data's Day, the story progresses, and I'm going to cover every bit of that detail in today's video. So, without further ado, let's get started. How a fallen genius ended up on Omicron Theta. So it all started with a broken genius named Noonien Soong, who was obsessed with creating artificial life. You can call him a mad scientist, but a more appropriate term would be tragic, because it ended pretty tragically for him, and I'll get into that. So the guy had to face a lot early in his career, totally misunderstood and mocked for having high hopes. And I don't blame him, honestly, because it was in his genes. His ancestor, Arik Soong, was a genius and notorious geneticist from the 22nd century. He was a very controversial figure in Star Trek history for his obsession with the illegal genetic engineering of humans. Now, as a son, Noonien was gifted with this madness, but his focus was more on the cybernetics than on the genetics. He wanted to create a machine that would be just like a human, and that's why, early in his career, when he used to work as a star scientist in Federation Science along with Ira Graves, he constantly talked about creating positronic brains, which was something that intrigued a lot of fellow researchers at first, because he sounded so excited and enthusiastic about it. But you know invention ain't that easy, as it takes a lot of your time, patience, and even blood and sweat. And what Soong had to face was brutal, to be fair. Earlier, his positronic brain project underwent many experiments, but they failed. So, the papers he submitted were criticized, and people thought that Noonien is mostly all talk. So, they started mocking him, humiliating him for his dreams, and giving him a nickname, often wrong Soong, which used to piss him off. Finally, Noonien decided to leave the Federation and start working on his own project. He doesn't have to prove to anyone but himself that he can create what he thinks of. So, then came Omicron Theta, a faraway planet inhabited by humans, where Noonien took his shelter, taking his wife, Juliana, with him. In Omicron Theta, he worked in total secrecy, with no one there to judge his work or criticize him. Before Data, the prototype kids that didn't work. Failure is a shitty feeling, and when it happens multiple times, it's hard to get through it. But our tragic scientist Noonien was a master at making things right at any cost. Earlier, in Omicron Theta, there were 3 prototypes he made before Lore and Data came, and his intentions were changing. He wasn't just inventing life, but he wanted to create something that he could raise like a son. Something that looks like him, talks like him, and even thinks like him. And with that paternal obsession, mixed with creativity, Noonien created these prototypes, with Juliana helping him in the process. But these early prototypes were a complete failure. One of them can either talk, but cannot think, and another one can process information, but doesn't interact. So in a way, they were all just practice lessons for Soong to know what to do and what to avoid. But trying to do a little better than his previous 2 versions, he created another prototype called B4. All these prototypes looked like Soong, but B4 had a terribly insignificant brain. He was just a little better version of the previous 2, as he could talk, follow basic instructions, and move, but he was also unfinished, and his thinking was too slow. So, B4 was ready to be chucked out at any point, as Soong evolved in his inventions so much that he finally created what he wanted from the very start: Lore, the first ever artificial life model created by Soong before even Data came into the picture. But the creation of Lore turned out to be a total nightmare for both Soong's family and the colony of Omicron Theta. Lore, the first son who went terribly wrong. Lore had quite a villainous journey in Star Trek. After years of failure and experiments, Soong was finally successful in making what he wanted, and it was true that Lore, initially, was a success. He was exactly like Soong in every way, curious and interactive about life, but that was just the beginning. Lore had a weird kind of arrogance against the colonists. He started mocking them, looking down on them for being humans, and thinking of himself as the greatest creation of all time. It was hard for Soong and Juliana to take at first, and they tried to ignore it, thinking it might evolve over time and gain some more self-awareness, which Lore did have, but rather than using it well, he abused it. He became a real pain for the lives of these colonists who didn't have any problem with Soong and his positronic creations, but this kind of cruel behavior wasn't expected from what he created. And then, the ultimate cost Soong had to pay for his creation when Lore directly contacted the crystalline entity, a gigantic organism in space that destroys the colonies. Lore was well aware of how the colonists established communication with outer space, so, leveraging that information, he sneakily sent a specific subspace signal to this monstrous entity, asking him to destroy the colony. Now, it's hard to know exactly what drove Lore to take such action. Maybe it was his hatred towards the colonists, or maybe he wanted to wipe them out to rise in power, but it was true that in exchange, he wanted a safe place only for himself, which tells us how selfish and cruel his human instincts were, even though it was all programming. As the entity hit the colony without a proper warning, except for one distress call that alerted Dr. Soong and his wife. And only Soong and his wife managed to escape, while the rest of the colonists were killed. And amongst the deaths, Soong found himself responsible for this. He failed as a scientist and now as a father who couldn't raise his son properly. So, instead of fixing the error, he decided to destroy Lore. He deactivated him and separated all his parts, thinking that might end Lore's chapter once and for all. Building Data, Soong's second chance at a perfect son. Another mistake and another lesson for Dr. Soong. And this time, he got more than just cautious. Shortly after creating Lore in 2336, Soong created another model exactly like Lore and named him Data. Now, Data differs in many ways from Lore. He has the most advanced positronic brain. He can think, learn, and most importantly, grow. But in his earlier programs, there wasn't much emotion given to him. It was a deliberate choice made by Soong because installing programmed emotions in Lore made him troubled, and that's why he couldn't channelize it properly. So Data needed proper guidance, just like a child who grows up slowly and steadily without a hurry. Data was programmed with proper human growth and development. Like Soong built the aging program in him so that Data could age like a human. But apart from that, he had immense strength. He was immune to disease, any kind of radiation, and could even breathe in the lack of oxygen. Also, with 800 quadrillion bits of memory capacity, he can remember anything and everything, and can run 60 trillion operations per second. He could process human emotions, learn to adapt to them, but not always. And what made him look more android than human was his way of speaking. He couldn't use contractions in sentences, like he just fails to say can't or won't. Instead, he says cannot or will not, which proves that at the end of the day, he's still a robot. However, Soong and Juliana gave so much effort to Data, like giving him everything they tried to give Lore but failed at. Soong and his wife fed him much information, especially about the journals and data of the colonists who lived there, so that Data could form a friendly bond with them, unlike Lore. Before even bringing him face to face with the humans, Data learned so much about them that he had both curiosity and a sense of affection towards them. And then another deliberate choice made by Soong was the wiping of early memory in Data, and he did that sometimes before the crystalline entity attacked Omicron, so that if Data survived, he could have a fresh start, an unbiased start, and not the baggage of such loss and deaths. When everything died, the day Omicron Theta fell. So, the crystalline entity that wreaked such havoc on Omicron was a very powerful, giant-sized, spaceborne lifeform that feeds on energy and consumes organic life. So, when Lore invited this total destruction on Omicron Theta, the doom was obvious. But neither Data nor Lore actually witnessed this destruction. Soong deactivated and disassembled the parts of Lore because there was no point in fixing him, but he also deactivated Data and stored him safely somewhere. The destruction was so rapid and so many deaths and damages at that same point, Soong had no idea whether Data was safe or not. So, Juliana made a heartbreaking choice, which was later revealed in the episode called Inheritance. In the midst of the destruction, when Soong and Juliana tried to flee the colony, Juliana lied about Data, saying that he had been destroyed by the entity and there was no point in returning or retrieving it. Juliana was scared after what Lore had done to them, and that was very natural. She thought that if they rescued Data and put him back in the program, he would end up just like Lore, because no one can be very predictable about them, and that's why Data was left alone in the ruins. Juliana didn't know if Data was safe, while actually Data was inactive in the ruins and left alone. Soong returned to Earth with despair because both of his creations couldn't remain long enough. Lore was a mistake, and what happened to Data was a tragedy, according to what he knew so far. Waking up alone, Starfleet finds the last survivor. 2 years later, in 2338, Omicron Theta was visited once again, and it was Starfleet that sent their survey ship to look for any signs of life on the planet. They saw the entire colony as it was before, but it was totally lifeless and empty. And in that lifeless colony, they found Data in its inactive state. He couldn't talk or move, and his early memories were wiped. First, Starfleet assumed Data to be just a machine, but upon further inspection, they realized it had a really advanced positronic brain. Data was reactivated, but this time when he woke up, it was in a completely different world with different people everywhere. Although his memory was wiped, there were some logs and programs installed in his brain that reminded him of the colony he used to live in. So, Data joined Starfleet and chose not to stay just as a lab specimen for them to do their experiments on him. He was the first ever android who entered Starfleet Academy, and there, with the rest of the human cadets, he studied subjects like astrophysics, engineering, Starfleet tactics, interstellar law, and command procedures, and whatnot. After completing his graduation, he was commissioned as an officer, and then, due to his positronic brain, he was extremely good at computation and data analysis. He could recognize any pattern in just seconds, and had a tremendous memory that would process vast amounts of information. Also, just like Soong, Data was interested in cybernetics and artificial intelligence, but at the same time, his curiosity was more about learning human history, all kinds of languages, and human behavior. Then he was assigned to the USS Enterprise D as the operations officer under Jean-Luc Picard. In this role, he used to control the ship's systems, coordinate internal operations, and help in scientific missions. However, beyond just these duties, he learned to be more like a human by acquiring hobbies. He learned how to paint, he studied art, music, and literature, and even learned how to play the violin. It seemed like Data never wanted to be bound by specific standards, as his hunger for knowledge and desire to become a human were stronger than his innate robotic nature. Awkward family reunion. Soong, Data, and the stolen emotion chip. Well, The Next Generation is one of my favorite Star Trek shows because things are never really so simple in this story. It's always good and bad things going on in a cyclical motion. It was going fine with Data, as he had now become a valuable asset for Starfleet. But then the most heartbreaking incident happened in the later episode, Brothers, that I have to talk about. In this episode, Soong, Data, and Lore finally had a reunion, but it went terribly wrong. After leaving Omicron Theta in 2338, Soong lived in Terlina 3 in isolation, where he reactivated his homing signal, which could determine if Data was alive or not. And he found out that Data was alive and had joined Starfleet, which was not very impressive to Soong, because like a typical father figure, he wanted his son to stick to cybernetics just like him. However, secretly in a project lab, Soong had been preparing an emotional chip to give Data. This chip had all the information which initially Soong didn't include in Data's settings, like affection, joy, fear, and sadness. And now he wants to give it to him to make him a complete human being. Also, with the help of that homing program set in Data's deep original programming, Soong learned how to control his son for some time. So, to make sure Data comes to him to get the emotion chip, his homing program took over Data's body, allowing him to hijack the USS Enterprise D and go straight to the lab where Soong was. The USS cadets were confused and frightened, while Data himself had no idea why he was moving against his will. Eventually, the father and son reunited in the lab, as we found Soong, now very old and decaying, and Data in his Starfleet suit more polished than ever. But right at that moment, Lore arrived to interrupt the father-son reunion. Turned out the same programming that activated Data worked on him too. First, he pretended to be nice and affectionate towards his family, but soon they realized Lore came here for something. The moment he laid his eyes on the chip, he wanted to grab it. So he stole it and injured Soong in a terrible way. Soong took his last breath in the lab, and the emotion chip was gone with Lore, which Data couldn't get initially. But then, in the two-part episode called Descent, Data went after Lore to save the chip. He defeated his evil counterpart, disassembled him one last time, and took the chip from him. Data wanted to destroy the emotion chip, but couldn't. Geordi LaForge convinced him to keep it, so that in the future, they could use it again in some way. In Star Trek Generations, he finally installed the chip to connect it with his positronic brain, and then, in First Contact, he was seen controlling it as well. When Data became a dad, the short, beautiful life of Lal. Now, as the story progresses, we come to the most heartwarming moment of Data's life, which would soon turn into the saddest memory of his life. It's about the moment when Data decided to create his own offspring, just like Soong once wanted to be a father. So he created a human child, a girl, whom he named after the Hindi name of endearment, Lal. But it wasn't Data's decision on how she'd look. He would rather let her decide how she wanted to look. Although at first it was decided she'd look like Deanna Troi, that could have been a bit awkward. Lal became a full-fledged woman, with warm skin, dark hair, just as human as other women in Starfleet. Her positronic brain was way more advanced than her father's. She had all those emotional capabilities that once Data was supposed to have but didn't. She could even use contractions in sentences like can't or I'm, which was something even Data was unable to do. Lal was a fast learner, and she could very well process the emotions and interact with them. Like that very awkward scene where she impulsively kisses William Riker in front of everyone. It just shows how fast she was growing, and her emotions are getting complicated, like humans. But then, the inevitable happened. Emotional programming made her feel fear and sadness, which at some point became overwhelming for her. Starfleet intervened. They didn't want this to go on unchecked, so they planned to take her away, possibly to the Daystrom Institution. Data didn't want that to happen, so they tried to defy the orders. Even Picard, on behalf of Data, talked to the Admiral, trying to convince him that Lal is a sentient being and she must have her own rights. However, poor Lal had a positronic cascade failure due to so much stress and emotional overload, which caused her death on the ship. It was a very heartbreaking moment in Data's life as he witnessed the death of his daughter, something he created with a hope, and the only thing he knew as his family. It seems like history repeated itself. Just like Soong lost his sons, Data lost his one and only offspring. Later, after Lal's death, Data took her memory and transferred it into his system because he was unable to process the grief. So, with the transferred memory, Lal continued to live on in Data's mind. The android who chose to die like a human. Well, as I've reached the end of this video, I have to tell you what actually happened to Data in the ending moments of his life, which took place in the movie Star Trek Nemesis. In Nemesis, Data has already spent years trying to understand human emotions, but in this pursuit, he came to know about a great deal of human values, like what it means to lead a human life, to become a purposeful man, and the worth of sacrifice. So in Nemesis, the Enterprise is facing a bigger threat, the clone of Picard, Shinzon, who controls the warship named Scimitar. Now this ship carries a Thalaron radiation weapon that can even wipe out all life on Earth. Shinzon already activated the Thalaron weapon to destroy the Romulan Senate leadership on Romulus, but Picard boarded Scimitar to stop him, but he got trapped in the ship. Data, without wasting time, used a personal transporter or a beacon to board the ship to save Picard's life. He successfully sent Picard back to safety, but he realized one thing pretty quickly. It was quite impossible to stop Shinzon, essentially because of the weapon. So he needed to stay behind on the ship to destroy it, even if it meant sacrificing himself. So he destroyed the Thalaron generator by firing on it, which unleashed a destructive chain, taking out Scimitar and himself. However, before boarding the ship, Data made one last smart decision, which was to download his memory engrams to his less advanced inferior brother, B4, as a legacy that needed to live on before he could embrace his death. And then, the ultimate sacrifice that you can't expect from a soulless robot. It seemed like the human values he learned over time were so rooted in his system that he used them in an effective but most heartbreaking way. Nevertheless, years later in the new chapter called Star Trek Picard, the story took a new turn. Bruce Maddox extracted his memory engrams from a single positronic neuron, then reconstructed his consciousness, and now exists in a very complex quantum simulation. It was a gift of immortality that Maddox gave to Data, but the problem was that Data never really wanted immortality. He wanted to die like a normal human being, in peace. So when Picard died and encountered Data in that very same simulation, Data made one last request of him. He asked him to terminate the simulation so he could fade away for good. And then came the most emotional ending sequence, where Data lay on the couch with Picard by his side. As Picard initiated the shutdown, Data turned into an elderly dying man and took his last breath on that couch. Eventually, the whole simulation faded away along with Data. Final resurrection in Star Trek Picard Season 3. But the end was not there yet for these Soong-type androids. While the Data we knew from the start was gone permanently in Picard Season 1, but in Season 3, he was once again brought back to life. Season 3, which was set in 2401, revealed that Dr. Alton Inigo Soong manufactured a new synthetic body named Daystrom Android M510. This synthetic body houses the full legacy of Soong-type androids, meaning both Data and Lore, their daughter Lal, and some remnants of B4. This version was created to salvage the neural patterns and the archived codes, but some instability was detected when the USS Titan A activated it. Lore tried to assert his dominance over the body because, he always looked for an opportunity to rise in power, and that created a psychological struggle within the synthetic. Lore's memories and emotional structure were stronger than Data's fragmented engrams. So, Data did something really unexpected. He allowed his evil brother to absorb all his memories and emotional quotients, like friendship and loyalty, fatherhood, everything that overwhelmed Lore. This neutralized Lore's selfish mentality and unified all of these androids together. This synthetic now became a unified consciousness of Lore, Data, Lal, and B4. Data no longer simulated his emotions onto a chip, but processed them all as an integrated part of his identity. Also, this new synthetic body was designed to age and even die eventually, so there was no curse of immortality that Data had to worry about. In the end, the Borg Queen was hiding a massive decaying cube in the atmosphere of Jupiter. So, we saw a final confrontation between him and the Borg near Jupiter, when he piloted the restored Enterprise D manually into the heart of the Borg cube. While all the rest of the crew destroyed the beacon, which was transmitting the signal to the assimilated fleet, the cube was destroyed and the Queen was killed, ending the crisis. After that, we saw Data joining the former Enterprise crew at the poker table, in the 10 Forward Bar in Los Angeles, a very nostalgic callback to The Next Generation when Picard joined the table. So, Data's journey wrapped up with a lot of deaths, but still on a hopeful note that he got what he wanted. All his life, he wanted to become human, and in the end, the act of sacrifice brought out the humanity in him that rarely exists in real humans made of flesh and blood. People can even kill to gain immortality, but Data was way ahead of those desires. And then the final resurrection brought him back for sure. But by this time, he became a fully realized sentient, more than a conflicted individual without a soul. If you ask me for my honest opinion, Nemesis was the most mediocre film in the whole Next Generation franchise. But what Picard picked up from this trash was a breath of fresh air. They did justice to Data's character and finally gave him the closure that he really deserved. On that note, this video is also over. So if you've enjoyed this discussion, let us know in the comments about your favorite Data moment in Star Trek: The Next Generation. Until then, goodbye, and we'll see you in the next one.